Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Tuesday, August 5th, 2025. This is USA Today's The Excerpt. Today, a Texas redistricting plan is sparking a wider fight over Congress. Plus, we take an early look at some of the major Senate races in next year's midterms, and what to do amid a gloomy outlook for the stock market. Republican Texas Governor Greg Abbott has threatened more than 50 Democrats with legal action and removal from the state legislature after the lawmakers fled the state amid a heated redistricting battle. At President Donald Trump's urging, Texas Republicans have proposed a revised congressional map that could give the party a leg up in next year's midterm elections and the ability to flip as many as 5 U.S. House seats. Democrats in the state, limited by their minority position, used one of their few viable methods to protest by leaving Texas to break necessary quorum. The new maps, advanced by a Texas legislative committee on Saturday, create 5 new GOP-leaning districts and target Democratic incumbents, which would give Republicans in Congress more cushion to defend their slim House majority in other states ahead of the midterms. Abbott said in an interview with Fox News yesterday that gerrymandering can be done, or drawing lines can be done, on the basis of political makeup, as in Republicans versus Democrats, and there's nothing illegal about that, he said. But voting rights advocates argue the changes will suppress Black and Hispanic voters in a move that has set off a partisan tug-of-war. Amid the Texas redistricting fight, the clock is already ticking ahead of next year's midterm elections. I caught up with USA Today Congress reporter Savannah Kuchar for a closer look at some pivotal Senate races in 2026. Savannah, thanks for hopping on.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just start with North Carolina, where, we have some pretty big names involved, Savannah. Who are the players here and what's at stake?
North Carolina is an interesting race. It's one of 3 toss-ups, according to the Cook Political Report. And like you said, there are some big names, well-recognized names, that have already thrown their hat in the ring. On the Democratic side, you have former Governor Roy Cooper. He's a pretty popular figure among Democrats, specifically North Carolina Democrats. He has some national recognition. At one point was even floated as a possible VP candidate in 2024. He's officially announced his run for governor on the Democratic side. He's pretty much the presumed nominee. We'll have to see, of course, when primaries come around. But then on the Republican side, Cooper is expected to face Republican National Committee Chair Michael Whatley. He has President Trump's endorsement, and that comes after, though, for a moment, people were wondering if Laura Trump, President Trump's daughter-in-law and also a former co-chair of the RNC, would maybe enter the race. And she later said that she considered it, but then opted not to run a campaign in North Carolina. So yeah, there's some interesting names that are coming up in that state. And the other interesting thing about North Carolina is that it is an open seat. That's why you see these names jumping in that race. Is the current Senator Thom Tillis announced earlier this year, amidst some ongoing debate and party feuding over Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill. Senator Tillis announced that he would be retiring and leaving that seat open in what was already expected to be a pretty competitive race.
All right, well, we see another retiring incumbent in Michigan. Who is that, Savannah? And just outline this race for us, if you would.
So in Michigan, like you said, another retiring incumbent, and this would be on the Democratic side. Senator Gary Peters announced back in January that he would be not seeking re-election, and his announcement really leaves the seat open for either party's taking. Michigan is in the swing state category, and that race is, again, one of those 3 rated toss-up races. And so it'll be one of the more competitive ones and could really help determine and swing which party takes the overall majority in the Senate.
Well, let's go to Georgia, where you note that Democrat Jon Ossoff is one of several incumbents who could face a tough re-election. Savannah, what makes this race one to watch, and how competitive is it expected to be?
It's expected to be very competitive. One of the ones to watch, like you said, Senator Jon Ossoff is fighting for re-election in what has only really recently become a swing state. Georgia was, for a while, really seen as more of a Republican-leaning state, but Senator Jon Ossoff, as well as fellow Georgia Democrat Senator Raphael Warnock, when they won their seats both in a runoff in 2021, that at the time actually secured Democrats control of the chamber then, and it helped kind of usher in what was seen as like a flip in Georgia and made the state a competitive swing state that it is now. And it'll be a battle for Ossoff to hold on to that, to keep his seat. So far, he is already facing a couple challengers on the Republican side. Both Representatives Buddy Carter as well as Mike Collins, Republicans from Georgia, have announced that they will be running and competing for their party's nomination and seeking the seat in Georgia. So it'll definitely be one to watch, and I expect it to be pretty competitive.
All right, so we talked through North Carolina, Michigan, and Georgia. What are some of the other races you're keeping an eye on here, Savannah, just a little over a year out?
Both in Texas and South Carolina, we see some more MAGA figures throwing their names into the mix to challenge some longstanding incumbents. In Texas, this looks like Attorney General Ken Paxton is challenging incumbent Senator John Cornyn, who has been in office in the Senate since 2002. And so that one's expected to be very competitive, and it'll be interesting to see if Paxton, who currently actually leads in polls against Cornyn, if he wins that GOP nomination. Some Republicans have expressed concerns that he could be a deterrent to them in the general election. And obviously, Texas is a pretty deep red state, but Democrats, I think, will be a little energized if Paxton takes the nomination. It could actually make the state a little more competitive. So it'll be one to watch.
All right, great piece from you, Savannah. We have a link in today's show notes if listeners want to go check it out. Savannah Kuchar covers Congress for USA Today. Thanks, Savannah.
Thanks, Taylor.
The Trump administration will require some foreign travelers to post a $15,000 bond before they can come to the United States. Fewer than 1.5% of foreign travelers who arrived by air or sea overstayed their visa in fiscal year 2023, according to the Department of Homeland Security. That's about 565,000 people who overstayed versus the more than 38 million foreign travelers who departed on time. But some countries have higher rates of overstay than others. As part of a 12-month pilot program, the Trump administration plans to apply the bond rule to countries whose travelers more often ignore the conditions of their visa and stay beyond its expiration. That's according to a notice published in the Federal Register yesterday. The notice did not specify which countries will be targeted, but said the list will be posted on the State Department website later this month. DHS estimates it costs more than $17,000 to arrest, detain, and deport a foreign visitor who remains in the country beyond their required departure date. You can read more about some of the countries with the highest rates of overstay with a link in today's show notes. Forecasters are predicting a dismal decade to come for stocks. I spoke with USA Today personal finance reporter Daniel Devisay to get a better sense of what that actually means. Daniel, thanks for joining me.
It's my pleasure.
So, Daniel, we know the stock market has had some real turbulence this year, to say the least. But what's the broader outlook for the years to come, and how does that compare to some of the growth we've seen really in the market in recent years?
It turns out that the forecasts for the next decade, the next 10 years for the stock market, are pretty bleak. Vanguard, which is a very trusted brand, thinks that U.S. stocks will rise by about 4% a year, 4% over the next decade, which is way less than 10%, which is what the stock market usually rises by on average, right? Morningstar is predicting a 5% average annual gain for stocks for the next decade. Goldman Sachs, which is another trusted brand, says 3%. And those sound to me more like, high yield savings account rates or bond rates than stock market rates. So it's pretty gloomy.
Wow. Well, in terms of what's actually happening here, Daniel, I mean, why do economists have these dim forecasts for the market in the coming years? And just what are some of the specific factors at play?
Well, I don't want to scare people, but there's something called the CAPE ratio, which is basically a price to earnings measure of the market. And the stock market has a really, really high price to earnings ratio. What that means is if you think of stocks as a product, the price for stocks is relatively really, really, really high. You're spending a lot of money to buy stock shares, and you're not getting much value for those shares. If you look this up on the interwebs, this price to earnings ratio is as high now as like wickedly high as it was in 1999, which was right before the huge dot-com bubble bust thing. The decade that followed produced the Great Recession, which was horrible. The other time, and again, not, hold on to your seats, folks, that this price to earnings ratio was really, really high was 1929, right before the Great Depression.
Yeah, big year there. Well, you mentioned the Magnificent Seven in this piece, Daniel, and we can talk about that here in a second. But why do investors keep buying pricey stocks like these? These are stocks like Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, right?
Yeah, so those Magnificent Seven, Amazon, Apple, Tesla, Microsoft, NVIDIA, are a third now of all the value that's in the S&P 500, and it's 500 companies. So those 7 monster stocks have this huge weight, and that's called concentration. The stock market is said to be too concentrated right now. And what that means is if you've got your money tied up in these like S&P index funds, you may not realize it, but a lot of your money is tied up in these 7 stocks. And it's just basic stock market education that you're not supposed to own a lot of a few stocks. You're supposed to diversify. And here's the other bad thing is that those 7 stocks, as high powered as those companies are, as great as they've been in their performance, those stocks are said to be overvalued right now, meaning basically they're priced out. The forecasters don't expect them to gain much in the next bunch of years. So if you own these magnificent 7 stocks, you shouldn't expect a whole lot of returns the next several years on those stocks.
Stocks are how many folks help finance their retirement and more. What advice do you hear for investors in this moment? What types of stocks should folks circle in the years to come?
Yeah, and I'm not peddling this myself, but the people at Vanguard and at Morningstar, both very, very good firms, have 3 very specific recommendations. One of them is what's called a value stock. That's basically a stock that's a good deal, meaning that it's trading at a low price relative to the corporate sales, what the company's actually doing. So look for value stock indexes. Those are expected to do pretty well in the next bunch of years because they're a good deal. Also, small cap stocks, which are for small companies, that's a way to skirt and get around those magnificent 7 behemoths and invest in smaller companies. Those are seen as a pretty good deal for the next bunch of years. And finally, foreign stocks. A lot of analysts say the foreign market is a better deal right now just because they're not as inflated in price right now as the American stocks.
All right. Daniel Devisay covers personal finance for USA Today. I appreciate your time as always, Daniel.
Always a pleasure.
Voters in the preseason U.S. LBM coaches poll have weighed in, and the top 25 in college football is now out a few weeks ahead of the opening games later this month. Texas took the top spot, followed by Ohio State, Penn State, Georgia, and Notre Dame, rounding out the top 5. You can check out the full list and some potential snubs at USA Today Sports. Thanks for listening to The Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your audio. And as always, you can email us at podcasts@usatoday.com. I'm Taylor Wilson, and I'll be back tomorrow with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.